Okay, awesome. So we should be live. Welcome everybody who is joining to the Radical Philosophy Hour. It's really exciting. We have again sort of tried to revive the Radical Philosophy Hour, and hopefully we're able to through the course of time have a lot of really interesting and great talks, and I think we've got one for us today. Before I get started, what I did want to do today as well, personal point, and just want to say the UAW is out on strike, and I just want to sort of send rays of love and solidarity to those folks. So good luck in the struggle to everybody there. All right, so today we are really excited. We have a really great lineup for you, those of you who are tuning in. We have Falguni Sheth from Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Emory University. She's the author most recently of Unruly Women, Race, Neocolonialism, and the Hijab. And that book explores the racial and gendered effects of neoliberalism and neocolonial feminism on Muslim women of different backgrounds in the US. Her previous books include Toward a Political Philosophy of Race. Her research is in several areas: social contract theory and violence, methodologies of critical race theory, anti-colonial studies, and transnational and post-colonial feminist theory. Sheth is an organizer of the California Roundtable for Philosophy and Race, and she has also written for several public forums, including Salon, Inside Higher Ed, Alternet, Common Dreams, Naked Capitalism, Z Magazine, Mufta, and New Economic Perspectives, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Today, she'll be talking about racial dismissal as a practice of settler colonialism. We are also joined by Margaret McLaren, who holds the George D. and Harriet W. Cornell Chair of Philosophy at Rollins College, and who serves as the Director of Sexuality, Women's, and Gender Studies there. Her most recent book, Women's Activism, Feminism, and Social Justice, develops a social justice model for transnational feminism, emerging out of women's grassroots activism in India. She is the editor of Decolonizing Feminism, Transnational Feminism and Globalization, and the author of Feminism, Foucault, and Embodied Subjectivity. She's also published articles and chapters on transnational feminism, decolonization, women, globalization, human rights, care ethics, feminism, cooperatives, economic empowerment, and Foucault. Today, she'll be talking about decolonial reproductive justice, post-colonial perspectives on reproductive issues in India. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Falguni.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Brandon. I'm really happy to be here with the Radical Philosophy Association. In fact, I think one of my first pieces was published with the RPA years and years and years ago. So it's really kind of exciting to be back and having this conversation. And I'm thrilled to be doing this with Margaret. So I'll just get started. My talk today is kind of very long and jargony, or at least the title is Racial Dismissal as a Practice of Settler Colonialism. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk through it. I may decide to change my mind and just put up a PowerPoint, but it might be easier just to talk through it. So this is a project that emerges from the second book, where I'm writing about neocolonialism and liberalism, and using the example of Muslim women in employment discrimination cases and in prison discrimination cases. And I looked at about 150 cases in the course of researching for the book. And part of what I was really interested in was kind of thinking about how grievances get adjudicated within the US legal system. And while I was doing it, I discovered a really interesting thing. And actually, it was kind of the second half of the book. As I was finishing up, I was realizing this. Part of what I was researching was the idea that discrimination, religious discrimination, has somehow ended. Now, this was well before 2016, let me just say that much, right? But kind of hailing the notion that we're the United States, a liberal society that heralds religious freedom. And one of the ways in which this emerged was with a case that occurred that actually went up to the Supreme Court in 2014. And it was about a young Palestinian American woman, Samantha Alaf, who interviewed for a job at Abercrombie and Fitch, and she wore a headscarf. And she asked if it would be a problem. And she passed, all of their other tests with flying colors, was clearly somebody that would have done well in the retail position that she was applying for. And so the person who had interviewed her, the manager, said she wasn't sure whether the headscarf would be an issue, but said that she'd get back to her. Well, as it turns out, yes, it was an issue for upper management. And so she was not hired. So subsequently, she sued. And this was not the first case to have kind of involved Abercrombie and Fitch and different kind of religious discrimination issues, in fact, with other women. But this was the first one that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in 2014, the court handed down a decision that said, yes, indeed, she had been discriminated against. And nationally, there was this huge kind of celebratory response. Oh my God, religious discrimination, it's over. We really can take refuge in this fantastic decision. And 2014, you'll recall, was about 13 years after 9/11. So it felt really momentous. And I was a little suspicious. I thought, I'm not sure this is the case. So I started looking into a number of other cases. And that's how I decided to kind of think about employment discrimination. And it turns out that there are many, many, many cases involving Muslim women who wear the hijab and who sued because their employers were discriminating or because they felt that they were discriminated against in a variety of other places like prisons and courthouses, actually. And I remember reading about this before I moved to Atlanta, where Emory is, because I had been doing this work for a long time anyway, and wondering about the number of cases where women wearing the hijab were discriminated against in courthouses in Atlanta. And when I got here, I realized it's, well, I'm going to save that punchline for a second. So there was a lot of this. And so as I'm reading through the cases, I thought, okay, well, this is just a kind of violation of different kinds of liberal principles of transparency. Well, so I wrote a whole article about that. And in fact, I wrote an article. That article was based on the Supreme Court decision that was handed down. And, part of what was really interesting to me was that it seemed like there was all this displaced animosity toward the head of Abercrombie and Fitch, who was, I'm now forgetting his name, but a queer white man. And Forbes wrote a piece on it. All of these other sites wrote pieces about how, OCD he was and how he was the one who was really responsible for this discrimination. And I thought, this just feels like it's displacing some other phenomenon that's happening. So as I wrote that article, and then I started looking at the Atlanta cases and realizing that there was something unique going on here. And in particular, the tone of the kind of judgments that were being leveled against Muslim women. And in particular, there was this case that some of the tone reminded me of. And it was this case called Muhammad versus Park in Michigan. And this is a woman, Jinnah Muhammad, who sued, and it actually had nothing to do with employment discrimination, but she was being sued for damages to a car that she had rented with Enterprise. And so she decided to kind of defend herself in small claims court. And the judge there, his name was Paul Parrick in Hamtramck, Michigan. He refused to let her present her defense on the grounds that she was wearing a hijab, although actually, according to the court transcripts, she was wearing a niqab, so it was covering most of her face except for her eyes. And the reason that he gave was, well, I can't see your face, and that prohibits my ability or inhibits my ability to see if you're telling the truth. Well, the ACLU filed various letters on her behalf saying, well, actually, we have disabled judges who are visually disabled, who have to rely on other methods to ascertain truth telling. We have witnesses who testify behind curtains because they're, in great danger when they testify. We have audio recordings. This doesn't make sense. And the state of Michigan, instead of allowing her to testify, doubled down. And so it went all the way up through the state court, and the state pretty much expanded the authority of Michigan judges to have complete authority in their courtroom, especially regarding, what witnesses wore when they were testifying. And the tone there was really interesting because Parekh, in the transcript, said to her, well, I really need to see your face. And she said, well, I'm happy to take this off in front of a female judge, but I can't. My religion prohibits it. And he said, well, he goes, no, it doesn't. It doesn't prohibit it. And how do I know this? I know this because I've talked to Muslims. And I remember reading this going, wait, what? I don't understand. What does this mean that he's talked to Muslims and Muslims tell him that this is not part of her faith? And she goes, I'm sorry to correct you, but actually it is. And he said, well, you can either, there's no female judge, you can take it off in my courtroom or have the case dismissed. And so she refused. And so he dismissed it. Now, that tone is what I'm thinking about when I say racial dismissal, because dismissal is technically, a legal judgment. It's a moral judgment, as we in philosophy know. It's a way of, dismissing a grievance or a case. But this was more than that. This was a really dismissive tone. And that tone was what I was reminded of not only when I was looking at some cases concerning Atlanta, but also when I came across a case in Alabama having to do with someone who was a waitress in an IHOP. And it took a lot of research to figure out what this was. Well, it turns out it was an IHOP under a large shell company. And she was suing for both racial and religious discrimination. And there was a similar tone where, despite all of this material that she was clearly being racially discriminated against, she said, all the N-word racial epithets left and right. The district court judge said, yeah, there's a little bit of that, but no, you're not really being discriminated against. And this person had been fired eventually because she was given fewer and fewer and fewer shifts, and her coworkers were harassing her for wearing a headscarf and insisting that she should be reading the Bible. But this woman was African American, and that was the first time that I'd seen that association. So I went back to the Muhammad case. I assumed that because it was in Michigan, which has a large Palestinian, Syrian, and Lebanese population, that this woman, Jinnah Muhammad, was one of those in background. Well, it turns out she was African American. Nowhere, or in one brief place, was there a mention of that, and I had missed that entirely. So that is what led me to think about this idea of dismissal. And in part, I've just finished a paper on this for Race and Class, but I'm actually arguing that it's a form of a racial and a gendered address, and it's a productive practice of colonialism. So it produces certain kinds of vulnerable groups as hostile or aggressive or stupid, as we heard when I was describing Parekh's response to this. And I'm making the argument that it's actually a cultural or a social violence against different kinds of racialized populations. And in part, I'm curious about this. And so I went back and I started thinking about Hegel on recognition. Yes, I know it's the RPA. Hegel is, let's say left Hegelianism. But I was looking at Glenn Coulthard's work, and he's an indigenous scholar who writes about settler colonialism in the context of Canada. And he makes the argument that actually, and Coulthard is actually drawing on Fanon, and Fanon's notion of recognition from, building on Hegel. And Coulthard argues that actually Fanon points out that recognition doesn't work in the colonies, right? And Fanon, as the kind of Caribbean philosopher, makes the case, and he says this in Black Skins, White Masks: the master laughs at the consciousness of the slave. What he wants from the slave is not recognition, but work. And he makes the argument that it's a lasting element of settler colonial societies. and that we have to kind of think about the asymmetrical nature of recognition in settler colonial societies, that this is a form of violent misrecognition which is pervasive in places like Canada and, frankly, also the United States. And this suddenly made a lot of sense when I was thinking about these cases, because it felt like part of what I've done, the work that I've done for the last couple decades, is to think about all of the subterfuges of liberal legal systems and of liberal laws, and the ways in which objective neutrality is thrown out there when we see, as in the case of police violence, brutality against Black populations, whether male or female or trans folks, that there is a way when if this kind of violence comes up before a courtroom, more often than not, these cases are dismissed against police officers. And I was trying to understand how this happens in a way where people seem to think that it's a procedural dismissal. And this is what started to make sense to me, that there is a certain kind of practice of objectivity that is camouflaged, that camouflages various kinds of biases and also various kinds of procedures. And so part of procedures like dismissal take place in the context of, well, you missed your filing deadline. You didn't actually file, in the right jurisdiction. And in the IHOP case, Karen Spears was told by the judge, or Deirdre Spears was told by the judge, that she should have either filed her case as a racial discrimination case or a religious discrimination case. And if she really wanted to sue on the basis of racial discrimination, then it was a different jurisdiction, a different deadline. So this is how the judge sidestepped the entire conversation. And I want to highlight this as a mechanism by which different kinds of populations are both racialized and also kind of kept in a certain precarious political and legal position. And what I turn to in thinking about this is Christy Dotson's work on epistemic silencing. And Christy Dotson points to a certain kind of testimonial incompetence, which I think is really interesting. So, in other words, the inability of an audience to hear a speaker when they're speaking about themselves. And so I appreciate that she lays the burden on the audience, and she says, well, the audience has an obligation to listen to the speaker, and the audience has an obligation to be able to discern the context surrounding a speaker's testimony. And this was really helpful when looking at these kind of legal discrimination cases, because it helped kind of make sense of the ways in which plaintiffs or other kinds of witnesses were dismissed when their comments didn't accord with what judges or district attorneys already thought that they knew. I just want to say a couple more things. I know that I don't have a lot more time, but I wanted to kind of talk about how this is a kind of phenomenon that I think really extends across different kinds of groups. And in particular, when I was writing this piece for Race and Class, I came across just a remarkable story, and it was published by ProPublica. It's extremely long and detailed. It's by Ken Armstrong, called The Landlord and the Tenant. And I would highly recommend that you take a look at it. And it's a story about a woman of Puerto Rican and Menominee descent in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who is sentenced to 3 consecutive 8-year sentences for having allowed her children to die in a house fire. Well, this is a woman who was trying to make ends meet, didn't have childcare, and moved into a house that had been under scrutiny for hundreds of housing violations by this but Brunner had hundreds of violations. He was constantly avoiding different kinds of charges and convictions. He filed bankruptcy 3 times in order to avoid various convictions. And he's given, by the end of this, the judge is so sympathetic to him that the judge gives him, for hundreds of violations, 3 different 2-year sentences of probation, even though the prosecutor asks for, I forget what it is, like 10 or 20 years. And on probation, because at this point he's extremely overweight, he's 600 pounds. And the judge's response is, oh, this poor guy, he'll just never survive in prison. And this is the kind of response that the judge gives to him, while the same judge, or not the same judge, a different judge who sentences Angelica Bellin, admits that this was not just her fault, but insists that she was responsible at the end of the day to save her children, even though the reason her children died was because none of these housing code violations were ever resolved. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm sure there's a lot of questions that I'm happy to kind of talk about. And I'm sorry for the schematic presentation, but I'm hoping we can have a nice collective conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Greatly appreciated. So that is a lot to talk about, some very interesting cases. So I'm glad that hopefully people who are tuning in online will have some questions, and if not, I certainly do. All right, so with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Margaret.
All right, thank you. Well, I'm also very happy to be here, to be on the Radical Philosophy Hour and to be here with Falcone. So I'm going to be talking through part of what I say and then reading other parts. But the first thing I need to say is it's based on a co-authored work, co-authored with a former student of mine, Sanjala Rajat. I wish Sanjala could be here to co-present, but they are in their orientation at graduate school at University of Oregon, so they cannot be here right now. So our paper is actually forthcoming in Feminist Formations in next month. It's, as Brandon said, Decolonial Reproductive Justice, Analyzing Reproductive Justice, Oppression in India. So the basic thing that we did, so we looked at reproductive justice frameworks, and we found them lacking, actually, for analyzing reproductive oppression in India in 2 different ways. So, I mean, just for those of you that don't know about the reproductive justice framework, it's a framework that was developed in the 80s by a group of African-American women at a conference. I can go into all of that later in the Q&A if you want. But the reproductive justice framework is really important because it shifts the conversation. I want to make connections between Falcone's talk as well. So it really shifts the conversation from a rights-based liberal conversation about reproductive rights, about choice and abortion and things like that, to a broader view of systemic injustice. So the kinds of conditions people need to raise children, and not just looking at the choice to have abortion, but also looking at forced sterilizations, and other kinds of reproductive justice issues. It has 3 core principles, which is the right not to have a child, which is what's talked about the most in the US, the right to have a child, and the right to parent those children in safe and healthy environments. And it's that third condition that really talks about material, economic, and social conditions that people are living in, including things like access to food, housing, security, and violence in neighborhoods. So the reproductive justice framework is a big improvement on a sort of more individualistic, choice-based, consumer liberal reproductive rights model. However, even though it brings in things like race, indigeneity, class, and ethnicity, when you try to apply it globally, for instance, in India, there are social structures in India that are actually more significant for analyzing oppression than race. And 2 of them that we focused on were caste and religion. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, so what we did is we actually brought in post-colonial theory. That's the connection to Falcone's talk. So in addition to the reproductive justice framework, we talk about Aimé Césaire, Edward Said, and Frantz Fanon, and we use them to highlight some of the things that are, we think, missing or not emphasized enough in the reproductive justice framework, specifically colonialism. And so now I'm going to read you a little bit of the paper itself. We talk just one more thing about this is all in the first half of the paper. We talk about race in the colonial context and how race in the colonial context also often emerges differently because, for instance, again, to take India, since that's where we were looking at in terms of the different reproductive, we analyzed three different reproductive issues: sterilization, sex-selective abortion, and surrogacy. And one of the things is that the understanding of race in the reproductive justice framework is a US-centric understanding of race, right? So it's based on a sort of actually black-white binary. It doesn't really take into account different races. But then the other thing is that it's not the category of race as it's understood in that in the black-white binary doesn't really do much for an analysis in India because it's not a significant feature of structural oppression, or not in the ways that caste and religion are. So here, okay. All right, so all right, I'm skipping a lot of other stuff too. So now I'm going to read a section of the paper, and then I'm going to read one of the sections where we apply our framework to analyze sterilization, and then I'll read the conclusion, and that should be about right for the time that I have. Analysis, the sterilization, sex-selective abortion, and surrogacy towards a decolonial framework. We use post-colonial theory with its attention to the history of colonization and the asymmetrical neo-colonial power relations among nations to expand the reproductive justice framework. Our decolonial reproductive framework, which includes caste, religion, and political context, allows for a more nuanced analysis of the factors that shape reproductive policies within India. British colonizers in the late 19th and 20th century had an interest in healthy and productive workers. Infant and maternal mortality was an obstacle to this and stoked, quote, pronatalist fears of depopulation and colonial anxiety about, quote, a shrinking labor pool. Colonial interest in reproduction connects directly to colonizers' investment in production. Pronatalist colonialist interest sharply contrasts with antinatalist post-colonial agendas of population control, which emerged as early as the 1950s, although both served the interests of global capitalism and development. India's family planning program, instituted in 1951, was among the earliest in the world. India's early adoption of family planning was in direct response to a global capitalist investment in quote, developing, scare quotes, developing countries to serve both state and corporate interests in population control. Underlying these directives were Malthusian ideas linking poverty to overpopulation, rather than to the historical operation of colonial extraction of resources and people, or to the ongoing operations of global capitalism. As Kalpana Wilson notes, quote, Malthusianism was, and has remained, closely intertwined with eugenicist ideas and more broadly ideologies of racial supremacy, and was intimately linked to the logic of imperialism, end quote. This eugenic logic applied to reproduction dehumanizes racialized populations in a neo-colonial process of thingification. And so thingification is a kind of a nod to Cesar, who we talked about earlier. Population growth in India was viewed as out of control, invoking Orientalist and racist stereotypes of hypersexualized, hyperfertile peoples who lack the discipline and self-control to refrain from sexual intercourse and reproduction. The birth control movement founded in the United States by Margaret Sanger quickly gained international reach. In 1952, when Sanger visited Bombay to launch the International Planned Parenthood Federation, she gave a talk linking large family sizes with national instability. Her Malthusian and eugenicist beliefs that social problems such as poverty and social instability are caused by, and can thus be solved by, population control exist in uneasy tension with Sanger's advocacy of birth control to increase women's choices and autonomy. Her visit reinforced India's family planning program, begun in 1951, and synthesized national and international investment in population control. This emphasis on population control of the, quote, socially disadvantaged, read, poor, disabled, minority, oppressed caste, Dalit, Adivasi, and Muslim populations exports the U.S. eugenics program to India. The intertwining and conflation of international pressures about family planning with population control indicates that family planning is less about women's autonomy and control over their bodies than it is about international and state control over women's reproductive lives. This international population control project of the racialized global capitalist structure frames the backdrop of reproductive control in India, colluding with far-right Hindu supremacists Hindu supremacism instrumentalized by the BJP government to target poor, Muslim, Dalit, and Adivasi is indigenous, populations as in need of reproductive control via the violence of genocidal population policies, forced and coercive mass sterilizations, and harmful long-acting contraceptives. Then I say below that we examine 3 issues. In the Indian context, sterilization can be understood as a manifestation of structural oppression in terms of caste and religion at the national level, but this is inextricable from global capitalist investment in curbing the population of the global South as a whole, guided by neo-colonial ideology in the form of neo-eugenics. Surrogacy further complicates this analysis, and the need for a decolonial approach in examining reproduction is made abundantly clear through the exploration of medical tourism and the racial and colonial implications of outsourcing gestation and birth through the surrogacy industry to the global South. In addition, the intertwined nature of these issues demonstrates the need to consider them in conjunction with one another and the meaningful ways in which a post-colonial lens deepens and extends existing analyses. So now I'm going to just read the section on sterilization and then skip the other 2 sections and then go to our conclusion. Sterilization. Employing a post-colonial lens brings nation as a category into focus as an underexplored area for reproductive analysis, despite the significant ways it impacts reproductive oppression. Population control measures by state and corporate interests in the global South are justified by a rhetoric of individual reproductive choice, as well as a developmentalist agenda that promotes the Neo-Malthusian myth that ties overpopulation to poverty. Global population control exerts its force on India through the racist and Orientalist myths of hypersexuality and hyperfertility. This racialized construction maintains the civilizing mission narrative of colonialism as a central force in shaping India's early population policies. The global investment in India's population control was so strong that India, among all Asian and sub-Saharan African countries, received the largest amount of international family planning aid from its initial implementation in 1951 through its peak in the 1970s. From U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson denying food aid to India during a famine unless sterilization was incentivized in 1965, to pressure from global organizations such as USAID, the International Planned Parenthood Federation, and the World Bank, population control was strategically forced onto India in a way that continues to shape the current landscape of reproductive control. Sterilization in India needs to be viewed both in the context of global efforts of population control targeted at those oppressed through colonialism, neo-colonialism, as well as the lens of structural oppressions within India itself. Within India, the Malthusian rhetoric of disposability is applied to Muslims, Dalits, and indigenous peoples, Adivasis. Within India, sterilization is still the most widely used form of birth control. The broad use of sterilization among Indian women can be traced back to the ways in which family planning takes place under the thinly disguised auspices of population control. Across class, caste, ethnic, geographic, and religious demographics, sterilization is the most common choice, which is in scare quotes, among women for contraception. A recent study claims, quote, the provisioning of free female sterilization and compensations for acceptors of female sterilization is perhaps one of the largest public investments by the national and state government in India, and that's from 2020. Compensation and the ease with which one can get sterilized call into question the voluntariness of voluntary sterilization and provide a counter to the uncritical use of the term choice. Although widely touted as voluntary, sterilization is often presented as the only option to poor, rural, and lower caste women. It should come as no surprise then that sterilization rates are higher for rural, uneducated women. Financial incentives often play a role in sterilization. Both the health providers and the prospective patient are paid by the government. A 2020 nationwide study in India recommends that financial incentives be decreased for women in the upper caste and upper socioeconomic levels and increased for lower caste and poor women. This targeting of lower caste and poor women for sterilization mirrors the global imperative of population control of those deemed disposable. As our framework highlights, Hindu religious, so there was a whole section that talked about Hindutva and the Hindu Rashtra, which will come up here, so I'll try to explain that as I go along. As our framework highlights, the Hindu religious fundamentalism works in tandem with neoliberalism and global capitalism to construct the targeting of specific populations deemed disposable for population control. Wilson notes how the economic reforms led by the IMF in the 1990s foreground the mobilization of oppressive and gender ideology for neoliberal governance and capital. Wilson further argues that, quote, violence is thus not an outcome of political and economic processes, but rather a core ingredient of capitalist development under Hindutva governmentality. The BJP, which is the current political party that's President Modi is from the BJP. The BJP's strong championing of far-right Hindu supremacist ideology and neoliberal policies thus re-entrench and intensify Islamophobia, caste supremacy, and patriarchy. One obvious example of the internal colonialism in India is the Balaspur sterilization camps that caused the death of 15 Dalit, Adivasi, and OBC, which stands for Other Backward Class, women in 2014. It reveals the inherently violent nature of Hindu fascist ideology, thinly veiled on the guise of population policy. Notably, sterilization camps are also set up in high-density Muslim communities, despite the prohibition of irreversible forms of family planning, such as permanent sterilization in Islam. Notions of progress and development are also implicit in the ideology of the Hindu Rashtra, and the targeting of poor, Dalit, Adivasi, and Muslim communities reflects the view that these groups are, quote, responsible for the backwardness of the country. The desire to craft a Hindu Rashtra is central to the selection of these specific populations as in need of reproductive control. The image of a pure Hindu nation that is invoked in Hindutva ideology necessitates the management of populations that are deemed aberrant or threatening. While this project of reproductive control is connected with broader economic motives and an internationalist agenda, at the core of this ideology exists the imagined religio-political image of a homogeneous India violently and eugenistically stripped of its poor Muslim, Dalit, and Adivasi communities. The dominant model of development supports this Hindu supremacist ideology and connects it to capitalist aims, resulting in the model of, quote, predatory accumulation by dispossession. This predatory accumulation model exemplifies India's internal colonialism by targeting Adivasi communities to gain control of their mineral-rich land. For the sake of corporate capitalist interests, Adivasi communities are violently displaced through the uprooting of entire villages, ramping up of militarism and armed vigilantism, and increasing police sexual violence against women and girls. These communities are targeted for forced sterilization as a means to control and limit population growth. A systematic process of dehumanization serves as justification and rationale for this extraordinary state violence. Fears about, quote, Muslim fertility rates, their uncontrolled breeding, and imminent outnumbering of the Hindu majority, end quote, were generated and stoked for decades to justify the 2002 Gujarat genocide and continue to be instrumentalized by the same BJP government and virulently Islamophobic Hindu ideology in order to justify mass sterilization of Muslims today. This fear of a Muslim majority also undergirds India's settler colonial project in Kashmir, where the abrogation of Articles 370 and 35A of the India Constitution makes it so, quote, India can now recruit non-Kashmiris to dilute the region's predominantly Muslim population, end quote. India's continued encroachment into Kashmir adds further nuance to the discussion of colonialism. The treatment of Dalits and Adivasis within India can be understood as internal colonialism, but as Usari notes, the very phrase internal colonialism assumes the unity of the nation state. In other words, the nation state may be seen as colonizing those within its borders, but the borders of the nation state are assumed as a given. Oh, okay. While the forced sterilization of oppressed caste, indigenous, and religious minority communities can be understood as an expression of Hindutva antinatalism, this is supplemented by a targeted pronatalism that focuses on encouraging upper caste Hindus to have more children. This two-pronged strategy of crafting a Hindu Rashtra exposes the threads of caste, religion, and nation that make up Hindutva ideology. And I see I only have 1 minute left, so I'm skipping to the conclusion. And I'll try to read part of the conclusion fast, and I'll skip parts that are repetitive. Here. I'll just skip to the end of the conclusion. We expand this framework of reproductive justice to include post-colonial perspectives, arguing that this strengthens the conceptual framework of reproductive justice and results in more nuanced analyses. Moreover, we note that in different national contexts, different categories may be more salient for analyzing reproductive justice issues. We recognize there are still areas for expansion in the decolonial reproductive justice framework. There are three in particular we would like to mention. First, the colonial construction of gender and the subordination of women under an artificially imposed gender binary should be examined as, quote, the imposition of a patriarchal colonial state and a tool of domination. Second, as we discuss, race functions differently in different contexts. In nations without a white majority, colorism marks differences of status among people of color, and these racial markers shift depending on national, cultural, and social context. And third, the global application of a reproductive justice framework would need to include discussions of diasporic populations. For example, an uncritical and orientalist framing of South Asian communities as exceptionally and uniformly patriarchal and sexist manifests in medical practice in Britain, with South Asian women's access to reproductive health services such as ultrasound scans being curtailed due to fears about sex-selective abortion. This reinforces the importance of applying a decolonial reproductive justice framework, even in the West, to reveal the way that coloniality structures reproductive choice and agency for diasporic populations. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much. That was really, again, just full of things to talk about. So I'm going to go ahead and start us off in terms of conversation or discussion. And I just want to start at a kind of a high level instead of getting into the weeds of what you're talking about, because there's a commonality that I've noticed that I thought might be useful for just unpacking. And it's the question, I suppose, of the relationship within colonial contexts between race, racialization on one hand, and then religion on the other. So, because one way of framing it would be race versus religion, and another might be race and religion, or even religion as race. So I was wondering if you could sort of tease out the pieces of that, because it seems like something that was really important in what both of you were kind of talking about.
Margaret, do you want to go first? Since
I was just going to ask you if you want to go first. I mean, I can go first. So at least in our, at least in this paper and this analysis, we're actually looking at race and religion separately, because as I said, race is not, it's actually, you know, I'm willing to be corrected on this or engage in conversation, but I have actually been to India 11 times. I've spent a couple of years of my life there and also done intensive research, not just lived there. So it's not a salient category in the way that's a salient category in the US. Because partly, I mean, when it is a salient category, it's sometimes a salient category with respect to whiteness and colonialism and the sort of like legacies of colonialism. But in terms of structures like structural oppression, I would say that race is not a category that is the most salient in the context of India in terms of structural oppression. In fact, there's been a lot of caste. I mean, there's actually been more anti-Muslim and caste violence in the last few years, and you know it's rising, and caste violence is going on right now, and there's a big, anyway, yeah. So I'll leave it there, Falcone.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fully on board with what you're saying. I mean, I haven't really spent a lot of time thinking about the race aspect in India, but I mean, it seems to me that Brandon's question also has to do with what are the intersections between religion and caste in the context in which you're talking about. And I don't think I've been to India 11 times, so, you know, fully conceding all expertise to you on this. In the North American context, I agree. I do think that race and religion often, or religion ends up intentionally being invoked to displace discussions of race. And I do think that religion is can be deployed in a racialized manner. So, I mean, I think you're right that especially, for example, this is kind of what my first book talks about, is the racialization of Muslims, that at some level, religion is not the kind of salient factor here, as much as it is a certain kind of dehumanizing of a particular group that is identified in a certain way based on geopolitics and based, you know, not necessarily on connections of colonialism to North America, but certainly British Empire in the so-called Middle East. So I do think that that's a legacy that we always have to contend with when we're thinking about race and Islam. So that's part of it. And I think especially in the context of the United States and the legal system, we don't have a way to think about race and religion in the same breath. So one is always kind of, you know, this is frankly part of what I would say. So Brandon, beautiful question. I mean, I think this is a colonial legacy. I think it's a tactic, if you will, a strategy of the aftermath of colonialism and the history of race in the United States, that these are kind of compartmentalized in order to suggest that they're qualitatively distinct, when in fact, I think that there's a lot of overlap. And it's also used, right, to kind of sidestep thorny issues. So I don't know if that addresses your question, but such a good question. There's so much to say about that.
Yeah, so I'm still waiting to see or hear from people online if they want to jump in, but I'll continue for my own part and follow up with, I guess, a question. I'm gonna kind of move away and talk a little bit about this question of racial dismissal first and sort of look at that. One of the things that interested me about what you laid out, Falguni, was this question of, you said it is a legal and moral judgment, but you kind of honed in on this idea of tone. But at the same time, it is a mode of address. So dismissal is a mode of address, but there's also a tonality to it. So I was just wondering if you could unpack that, particularly as it relates to kind of the question of objective neutrality. So that there's an emotional quality to that pretense of objective neutrality and the mode within which those kinds of judgments are made. So I was wondering, if you could kind of maybe talk a little bit about that question of the affective and emotional tonality that you're kind of.
Yeah, it's interesting that you name it in that way, because I mean, part of, in the way that conventional philosophy can often be done, you kind of lay out certain accepted, modes of deploying a category or of its definition, and then you suggest an alteration. And so I was trying to augment these kind of mostly neutral, apolitical ways of thinking about dismissal, legal dismissal, employment dismissal, with Monique Roloff's work on racial address. And so, I mean, I think her work is so phenomenal in thinking about how different kinds of phenomena are connected to create a certain, I guess, phenomenology of racism. And so she uses Jamaica Kincaid's work to kind of think about, for example, how, and now I'm blanking on the title of the book, but how a little girl is kind of socialized into understanding her place in the world. And, so in terms of ironing, in terms of her comportment to other people, in terms of her relationship to folks of Caribbean origin versus, folks of Caribbean origin who might be white, so that this indicates a certain set of relationships, a racial comportment, if you will. And so it's so interesting that you talk about it as emotion. I think you're right that there is a certain kind of affect. The way that I'm extracting this notion of dismissal is to think about it as it's coming out of what's not being said. Right. So, or even, so you're right that, for example, I was talking about this judge in Michigan who said, look, I'm telling you what it means to be Muslim, and being Muslim means that wearing what you wear, optional. Right. So he doesn't know the name of it, but he knows enough because he's talked to Muslims that this is optional, that the wearing the niqab is optional. And so I'm hesitant to say that it's emotional because I don't know what the nature of the affect is, but it is clear to me that there's something unspoken there that motivates his questioning, which was not obvious, which is to say that she's African American. And so part of the history is the silence, right, of slavery coming into play, the idea that Islam is somehow a foreign religion. I use foreign in quotes, that it's not indigenous, even though in fact it has various indigenous roots from the moment of, from the various 100 years of the slave trade. And so this sense that, well, you should be a Christian, you're not really a Muslim. And so I kind of argue that much more vociferously in the book. But I think that's why I'm thinking about this as a mode of silence, that dismissal indicates certain unspoken assumptions and what comes out in that. So So in the second example of Angelica Bellin, I have so many quotes that I could, kind of read to you, but just some of them are fascinating. So I have something along the lines of, let's see if I can find this from my own notes. Sorry. I have no idea how to do this. So let me just grab this I have two screens that I'm working off of here. So, Bellin, the judge's comments to Bellin have things like, you came from a terrible background. I feel for you, and her mother had also been arrested for violence against her children, which is a completely different story. But this judge is kind of likening them and saying, your mother was mentally ill. Are you mentally ill? I don't think so. You're weak. And then the DA will use certain kinds of language that says, it's beyond comprehension. How could a mother do this to her children, right? As if this was something that she intentionally tried to do, even though there's plenty of evidence that says that she just didn't have a choice, that she was poor and that she was trying to keep a roof over her kids' heads, albeit, one that Brunner was responsible for. By contrast, you hear the incredible sympathy that the judge has to Brunner. Obviously, the core facts of this case are not much more than a very simple fraud, even though he has hundreds of counts of fraud, embezzlement, housing violations against him. And the judge says the Brunner's barely ambulatory. He now weighs more than 600 pounds. To put him in prison borders on the unconscionable. The judge sentences him to probation, 2 years on each of the three, rather than lasting 6 years. His probation will last 2 because he's getting to serve these 3 different sentences consecutively. Obviously, there's no fine. He doesn't even begin to have the resources to pay. This guy is a millionaire. He has boats, yachts, houses. He's transferring houses into his son's name, right, in order to avoid arrest. So, I mean, the racial address, the comportment of this is such that Brunner gets this full sympathy, while this woman, is being, in some sense, it's an attitude that is a carryover, a legacy of colonialism and the civilizing mission, right? The uplift and civilize. This is how we treat our backwards people. And so she's still getting that. So again, very long-winded answer, but I'm hoping that kind of starts to address what is a great question.
Yeah, thank you. That's a lot there. And again, unfortunately, one of the limitations of this format is that we don't get the chance to do even more because in part, I kind of want to. But I know we try to get out of here on time. Margaret, I just want to give you one final question. So one of the sort of questions I guess I had as I was thinking about everything that you were saying is sort of what does, in terms of the act, because I know that this is work that you've done on the ground in terms of being there with people, what does the activism look like and how does it sort of inform, I guess, the way you're thinking about these critique of racial justice frameworks? Another way of saying it might be that, if there were a conference like the one that you mentioned that developed the racial justice framework, what additional things, and is it really the paper that you're writing is kind of like what you hope would come out of that conference? So if you could sort of talk about that for me a little bit.
Yes, I'm still thinking about your first question actually, and the ways it applies to things that Falcone said about the how she didn't know the plaintiff in Michigan or the defendant in Michigan was African American until you went back. So I'm actually still thinking about race and religion, but I will try to answer the question quickly. So this paper was almost purely theoretical. Sanjala and I started working at during COVID, and actually Sanjala didn't go home to India that summer. So it's a theoretical paper. Subsequently, we're working on another project now on queerness and transness and coloniality of gender in India. And for that project, we did do interviews with people. My on the ground work has been with women's co-ops in a very different way. But I also have gone and met with organizations that teach about reproductive justice issues, mostly basic reproductive health, and that was a part of a project about menstruation, actually, and menstrual health, and as it ties into reproductive health. So I think the activism on the ground looks like, as a result of that project, I was there with a student, and then I wrote an article with a partner from Barefoot College, which is a large, open, free college. Well, it's not really a college, but anyway, it helps to train people and educate people, not just women. But they do have a whole women's health initiative, which is a holistic health initiative, which talks about nutrition, as well as things like reproductive issues and reproductive justice. So I think going and sort of like partnering with organizations on the ground and also with people working in those organizations is one way that the activism can look. Another way is actually, a lot of times, I think, unless someone has a special interest in India, they're not really keeping up with the news in India. And so I keep up with the news, and I'm part of a weekly study group on Ambedkar, who's an anti-casteist, and there's a lot of anti-caste movements now. Like I said, there's actually a lot of caste violence in India right now. So I think one thing, which is sort of a kind of like a low bar activist thing to do, is to talk to people and educate people about what's going on. I mean, a lot of people don't know that Modi, who is in his second term in India, is very much like Trump in all the negative ways about sowing divisiveness, sowing hatred and violence, again, particularly against Muslims and against lower caste people. And so, there's been repression of like basic freedoms in India since Modi took power in 2014, and then, he was reelected. And so, yeah, so I mean, there are things I do on the ground. I meet with organizations, I give like talks, I work with them, sometimes I partner with them, give money. I'm a part of other people's projects when I'm there. I'm not the one organizing, for instance, demonstrations. When I was there on the Fulbright, there were some student demonstrations, not against these issues, but about other issues, right? So then I feel like my role is more to join things on the ground and to collaborate with people who are there already doing the activism. My activism is primarily US based.
Well, very cool. I'd still have all these questions, but I'm trying to get us out of here on time. Well, I got to say thank you both so much for coming. I really enjoyed it. Hopefully there'll be more questions coming in on the web, and I'm just going to forward them to you all, and you can handle it as you please. So again, thank you so much, and I'll hopefully see you both soon.
Thank you so much for organizing this, Brandon. It was an honor to be on this panel with Margaret. So thanks to Margaret too.
Yeah, thank you both, and same here, Falcone. It was great to be on it with you, and great to see you, Brandon. Thanks for the invitation.
Yes. Take care, y'all.
Okay, bye.